Hey everybody, welcome to the event. Sorry about the delay in start time. We were having some technical difficulties on our end, and as you can see, Ty still hasn't been able to connect with us here. So hopefully we can get him on here. Hangouts is just not cooperating today. Well, welcome everybody. I'm John, one of the coaches here at Udacity, and today we're going to be talking about some useful JavaScript functions. Particularly 10 that either myself or Ty or people we've talked to tend to use every day. And these are going to be functions that are a little bit more in the beginner realm of things, something that you can kind of begin using on the projects that you have now. And thank you all for posting all these wonderful questions. We'll try to get to all of those today. But first, I think it's best that we dive into some of these questions. And I'll also try to share the links to sort of the JS fiddles that we've created. So for those of you who have already been exploring JavaScript, you probably know that there's a lot of standard libraries included, including string, array, math, several other object libraries that exist that you can make full use of. And there is actually a lot of methods included in a lot of these standard libraries that just make doing things so much easier. And the first one that the first couple that I wanted to highlight today were specifically around arrays. Dealing with arrays can be really messy, especially when you kind of you want to iterate over things and filter them and take pieces out of an array or identify, what's going on in the array or applying the function to all the different things in an array. And fortunately for us, the array standard library has a lot of prototype functions built in that make this extremely easy. The first of which is the map function. The map function here, let me go ahead and screen share this little snippet of code we have already written up for you. The map function takes an array. It's going to basically apply some function to each component in the array. So in this case, we have this square function that we've created, and this is going to map a specific function to each element in the array. Basically, it's going to go over each element in this array 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then it's going to apply this function, this inner function here, to each of these elements. So in this case, it's going to do 2 times 2, 4 times 4, 6 times 6, 8 times 8, 10 times 10. And then, when we run this, we can see, yay, we get the result, 4, 16, 64, so on and so forth. Now, mapping comes in a lot of you use it for everything when you're managing arrays, when you want to just apply a function to everything in that array. I think is probably one of the methods that I've used the most in terms of arrays. And it just makes handling really complicated sets really simple. Now, similar to our map function, we have a very useful function, which is a filter. And filter functions sound exactly like what they are. They're going to filter over our array. The way filter functions are going to work, let me screen share our little example we have here, is it's going to more or less filter based on some criteria in our array. So in this case, we have an array of fruits. We see we have apples, oranges, pears, lime, melon, strawberry, blueberry, blackberry, boysenberry, lemon, and kiwi. And in this case, I want to extract all the berries. So what I've created here is a regex expression to grab out the berries. And then we're going to apply this on the fruits array, this filter function. And for this filter, we pass in a function which is going to take each of our fruits, and then it's going to return some Boolean value. So this callback function here is going to retrieve each of our fruits, like I said, and then this is just going to match it with this regex expression. The trick here is with the filter function is it's expecting some sort of Boolean value. So return true or return false. And so if it's true, then this berries variable here is going to be a new array. Berries is going to end up looking something like this. And it's going to get all the things that evaluate to true here. In this case, blackberry, boysenberry, strawberry, and blueberry. So hopefully that will come in handy later. I think that'll come in handy in project 5, where you'll have to be sort of filtering over markers and an array of markers set up. Oh goodness, it looks like we might still be having technical issues. Let me ping somebody this link real quick. So that is a pretty handy function. So we have map, filter, and sort of the last piece is the reduce function. Oh no, it looks like we're not streaming. Oh my gosh, what is wrong? One moment, folks. I'm just checking some things here, making sure our stream is working. All right, cool. Looks like we're seeing it just fine now. Okay. Whew. Apologies for those technical difficulties. I don't know what's going on with Hangouts today. What a mess. Apologies for those technical difficulties, folks. Yeah, it sounds like there are a lot of streaming issues today. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try and get Ty back in on this call. Looks like he's sort of trying to join. All right. Weird technical problems. Dang Google Hangouts. All right, so we went over, in case you missed it, the map function for arrays. We also went over the filter function for arrays. And finally, we're going to talk about the reduce function for arrays. So a common database pattern that you'll see, particularly in large distributed database systems like Hadoop or Mongo, is sort of the map, filter, reduce pattern. And so map, like I mentioned before, is going to map a function to each value in the array. Basically, it's going to iterate over each value in the array and apply that function to it. The filter function for an array is going to go over each item in the array. And if it passes some condition, it's going to shove all those into a new array that you can utilize. And then finally, the reduce method, which I will screen share our example code here. And I will share all these links on the forums afterwards. So you guys will be able to have an opportunity to play with them. The last one here is the reduce function, which is actually going to allow you to essentially, reduce this array into some single value. And it actually takes, I've only used 2 arguments here, but it actually can take up to 4 arguments: the previous value, the current index, and the array itself. In this example, I have sales by quarter. So, these are, we can assume maybe clothing sales or just some business that I'm at. I've made a bunch of sales, and I want to basically get the total sales that I got this quarter. Well, I can apply this reduce function. So it's going to take this callback function, which I've passed a previous and current parameter. And the previous and current parameters correspond to the place in the array that we're at. So the first pass into this function is going to get this index and this index, so 0 and 1. It's going to do 26.5 plus 30.43, and then it's going to move on. It's going to take that sum, which will be the new previous, and add the new current value, which will be 130.4. So it's going to go through this entire array and apply this formula. So it sums everything up. And in the end, we're going to get our total sales. That is the reduce function. And like I said, the map filter reduce pattern is very common when handling data. And it's going to help a lot just handling any sort of JSON file or data that you retrieve. So far, let's see, it doesn't look like there's any particular questions. Just a lot of questions about the streaming issues, which I apologize for. All right. The last two array patterns that I particularly like are the join and every patterns. Join is super handy for creating CSVs, in my opinion. I've used this a lot when getting, big lists of arrays or big lists of objects, and I need to sort of export them as a CSV, or I need to export some information with some separated values, or I just kind of want to like create a sentence or some sort of structure with my arrays. In this particular case, I have a team, a roster basically, and each item here is an array containing the player's name and their number. And I want to sort of export this as a CSV. So I've created this new team CSV variable. And I can do team.forEach. This is a common function that you can use on arrays, and it's basically going to iterate over each thing in this array, basically each player. And I will zoom in the text a little bit. There we go. That helps. Hopefully that looks a little better. That looks like it should be a little better. So this is going to iterate over each person in this array. It's going to then take that player and join the array with a comma, and then add a new line at the end. So what we're going to end up with is we're going to end up with something like number, and then that new line character, and then that new line character. And then this is all going to get shoved into this team CSV object, which is just a big string. So it's actually converting the arrays into string objects, which is really handy. And you can actually decide what this join piece is. In this particular case, I'm using a comma, but you can change this to something like a period if you want period separated values, or a tab if you want tab separated values. Or you can even just leave it blank, and it'll join everything in the array with spaces. And this can be handy for if you have an array of values and you just want like a single string, or like an array of characters and just want a single string. So the join method is really handy for, like I said, making CSVs. That's primarily where I've used it, and primarily where I've seen other people use it. Let's see, and then the last array method that I would like to mention today is the every. This one's a little less common, but particularly handy for when you want to sort of quickly check that everything in the array passes some conditional. In my particular example here, we have pump pressures. So maybe we're working at a water treatment center. We have a bunch of pumps pumping water through, and I want kind of a warning to be thrown if any of these pump pressures exceed some threshold. So what I can do is I can actually, instead of having to iterate by hand using some for loop or something to just run this conditional, I can say, all right, every on these pump pressures, which is going to apply this function to every pressure. And if it returns true, if any of these values return true, then this whole value becomes a Boolean. So this is a little bit like a map, but a map is actually going to return basically the same array with those functions, with that function applied. And it's a little bit like a filter, but the filter is going to return just the values that pass this Boolean. This is actually going to return a Boolean value itself. So system OK is either going to be true or false. And in my particular case, in my example, if the system's not OK, then we need to let people know that there's a broken pipe. So again, just to go over again those 5 array methods we talked about, there's the array map function, which is really handy, the array filter function, the array reduce function, the array join function, and the array every function. I'm going to check questions real quick, and then we'll dive into some of the other common functions that are super handy when first learning JavaScript. Let's see. I'm seeing you. So this one comes to us from Chris. He asks, is all of this part of vanilla and current with ES6 best practices? Hey, Chris, yeah, so these are all part of ES6. They're all part of the standard library in JavaScript. Everything we're going over here is built into JavaScript. It's not some third-party method that you have to pull in or anything. And yeah, these all stick to ES6 best practices. Currently, the examples are written up in ES5. But if you want to write them in ES6, you can just as easily use them there. And in fact, a lot of these standard libraries have additional functions in ES6. So for example, like the array library has a lot of additional methods on top of the 5 that I've highlighted here today. Let's see. Is there... What is, let's see. Abraham asks, can we get snippets in a gist? And Abraham, yes, I will be posting all of our snippets up onto the forum after this webcast, and you'll be able to find it in the front end broadcast channel on the Udacity forums. So feel free to check them out there. I'll make sure that you guys have access to those. You can play around with the snippets, play around with those bits of code. And I'll also try to post the answers to any of the big Q&A questions I answer today. I'm just going to clear out some of these questions about the broken screen, so it's a little easier to filter through here. All right. I'll dive into some of the other questions after I go over these next 5 methods that we have here. And if you guys do have any more questions, feel free to fire them in the QA section. So the next one that I want to sort of hit on is the object, which has a lot of prototype methods attached to it. And in particular, a super handy one is the toString method. Typically, the toString method is actually going to return it's going to basically return object, which looks a little something like this. Object, which may not seem super great until you start diving into wanting to sort of fact check some things. And in this particular case, we override the toString method to be more specific to our object. And that's really where the toString method comes in handy. So in this particular case, we've created this color object with these properties R, G, and B. And we create this dot string, which overwrites our toString method down here. Color prototype dot toString returns this dot str. And in this particular case, it's just going to report back our RGB colors. This is pretty common practice, and again is super handy for reporting on the values of the object. I really like this for quick inspection on the object instead of having to dive into the dev tools, or also if you want to report the contents of the object back to the user, it allows you to make a slightly more presentable version of the object. The next two are particular to strings themselves. And the first one is the string.replace, which I hope you're all familiar with if you went through the JavaScript basics course. String.replace essentially replaces a specific point in the string with some new content. In this case, we're taking the 0th, or the first position in the string, and we're applying this toUppercase function, which actually happens to be another fun string method for you to use. And in this case, we're replacing that first letter, in this case, G in George, with the uppercase G. This comes in handy with, in this case, in a lot of cases, capitalizing names, but it also makes for comparing strings a lot easier. A lot of times, right, you might be trying to compare George with George, and you're going to get like false a lot of the times, you're going to get false all the time because they're not an exact match. So using this toUppercase and making sure that there's some sort of standard way your strings are structured is super helpful. There's also a toLowercase method, which does exactly what it sounds like. It's basically going to take any string that it gets inside of it and turn everything to lowercase. And again, that's super handy if you're doing any sort of queries on the string or trying to match specific characters on the string. And that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these methods will be handy for Project 5, where you're doing a lot of conditionals on strings. The last one is the string.search method. Let's go over that one. So string.search, I actually used this a little bit earlier in a sense, but it takes a regular expression. So in this case, we have a regular expression that's going to match anything that matches this pattern. And if you're unfamiliar with regular expressions, I highly recommend you take a peek at them. They're super handy for pattern matching. It's an entire language around pattern matching. And in JavaScript, they're built in. You can make regex variables simply by just adding these backslashes. And you can put the pattern in between them. And so now this is going to contain this pattern. And now when I do string.search, I pass in the pattern that I want it to match. And if any matches occur, it's going to say, yeah, all right, there's no matches, otherwise return true. So in this case, this asks, is it alphanumeric? And it's going to run this. And if anything happens, it's going to say, whether or not it's true or false that it's alphanumeric. And we can see here that these are not alphanumeric characters. So this is going to return false. As I mentioned before, search is really great if you're searching over strings. Could also be really helpful for when you're iterating over an array and searching for like a specific piece, if you don't want to use the filter function. But fortunately for us, arrays have that filter function capability. So you really only need to use this if you have, say, like a big block of text, or you're trying to pick out specific patterns in a block of text, which can be handy for, say, machine learning, where you want to determine users' writing patterns, or if you want to find all instances of a specific word in a book. This method comes in handy a lot. Our final useful piece is the set object, which, before going to our example, isn't exactly a method, I know. but it's an array-like object for storing unique elements. And anything that's a duplicate that gets added will get deleted automatically. And insertion order is also preserved, so it's like a queue, you know, first in, first out, which is just super helpful. So let's take a look at this set example. And we'll go through this. And for those of you who missed part of the stream earlier because of the technical difficulties, we're going to make sure to throw this recording up online so you guys have access to it later. So we're creating our set, in this case, my set, and we're adding 1, 5, some text, and we're even adding this object. So like we mentioned before, a set's sort of array-like. It can hold any type of object, from integers to strings to object literals themselves. And we have this great has function, which lets us look over our set. In this case, because we've added a 1 to our set, we can say my set has 1, and it will return true. My set has 3. It'll return false because 3 hasn't been added to the set. 5, it'll return true. Math square root 25, which is 5, will return true. Has some text, will match because it's true. We have some text in here, and we happen to use our toLowercase string function. And we can even compare objects. Does it have this object? Yes, it does, because we've added it above here. We also have a size property, very similar to the array.length property, which will return how many objects there are in the set. And then we also have delete, which will delete instances of pieces in my set. So this is going to remove 5 from the set. And then if we ask, does it have that? It's going to return false because it's been removed. And when we ask for the size, it'll report back 3 because we just removed that. So it's very similar to an array, but remember, sets can only have unique instances of each of these. So if we try to add other pieces, like another 5 or another 1, before we remove it, it's not gonna push that onto the stack. It also has a pretty simple, method pattern with add, has, size, delete. It's a fairly simple option when you don't really need to use array methods. So we've hit on 9, and the last 2 I wanted to hit on were just the math library. I highly recommend you guys take a look at the math library. We saw the square root function, which is super handy, but it also has a pow function, which will do powers, a hypot function, which will calculate the hypotenuse, or the square root of the sum of the squares of its arguments of 2 values, which is just super handy for linear regressions, physics, and general math applications. And you can find all the information on these standard libraries on MDN. Again, the main standard libraries we went over today were the object, string, array, math, and set. And that's pretty much it. So let's take a bunch of questions here. For those of you too who are asking about, getting to see or play with these examples or run them yourselves, like I mentioned before, I'll be sharing these in the forum. I'll make sure you guys all have access to them so you can go and play around with them yourselves. So I'm just going to start from the top here with the most voted up questions and work my way down, and hopefully we can get to all the questions here. Jake asks, when will you have a Node.js course for not only backend development, but also for use in the front end as a helpful dev framework? I know the tool automation course is a good one to use, but I would have a course on Node.js. So a Node.js course is definitely something that's on our radar. We have no official timeline for it yet, but I've talked with Mike Wales a lot about it, and we both agree that it's an up-and-coming platform to develop on, and we are really interested in releasing some material for that. I wouldn't be able to give you a real accurate timeline, but it is something that's on our radar. If you do have any particular questions, though, about using it as a development framework for the front end, feel free to ask in the forums. We'll answer as best we can. And I have some familiarity using it. It's a really good platform to develop on. Has some of its own weird little quirks, but you tend to get used to them. Elizabeth asks, does Udacity have a course on regex? Does regex have a performance hit? So we don't have a course on regex. We use a lot in our courses, and you can kind of pick it up pretty easily. I'll make sure in the forum post to include some links, but there's a lot of online resources for learning regex, and there's a lot of websites that'll actually let you input patterns and then copy and paste some text, and it'll show you sort of what patterns you're matching with your regex. That way you can kind of experiment and play around with it, and I'll share some links with those as well. As far as regex performance, it depends. From my experience, I've seen just simple searches work better than regex sometimes, but it also depends on what kind of pattern you're matching, sort of how complicated of a pattern it is, and how big of a set of text you're searching over. But overall, in my opinion, regex is one of the better pattern matching libraries out there. And I definitely recommend taking a few minutes out of your day to learn it, get comfortable with the syntax. And you don't have to by any means memorize it. There's a lot of quick reference sheets online for regex. So you can research that. And like I said, I'll share some links for that with you guys. What are the cases in front end that we could use the set data structure? Yes, good question. So in my opinion, I haven't used set entirely too much. Some things that you could use set for is when you need a very easily mutable array, right? Arrays aren't super easy to mutate. It's hard to sort of like pop and push onto array because it's very hard to kind of pick out the data that you want to remove. Whereas a set, it has a much simpler set of methods that allow for that. So if you need to be able to really manipulate your array and identify objects in it, remove objects from it, push new objects to it, and only have one instance of that object in your array, then a set's going to be really handy. I guess a more practical example would maybe be if you're creating a database of employees. A set could be a good data structure for that, right? You're not going to have more than one instance of a person at your job site, and you want to be able to check and see if that employee is there, and you want to be able to remove that employee when they quit. And that's all the only really operations you need to be able to do on it. So a set would sort of be decent in that instance. I'll try to think of some other examples too, but that's sort of the first idea that comes to mind. Marina asks, what is the difference between a set and an object? So an object's going to have a lot of methods attached to it, a lot more than just a set. I'd liken a set more to an array. An object's going to have properties that you can access, and those properties, just like a set, could be strings, numbers, objects themselves. But the object's going to have an entire sort of prototype chain attached to it, whereas a set is just going to have access to the objects or items themselves and has a few properties for manipulating those. A set is a better container for objects than just storing a bunch of objects in an object, if that makes sense. This one comes to us from Omar. Is it better to write different JavaScript functions in separate files for each, or all in one file? Yeah. So I'd say when you're first starting out, try to stick to keeping all your JavaScript functions together in a single file. It's just going to make it easier for you to just kind of skim the file real quick and find those functions. As you begin, advancing and working on more projects, it does begin to make sense to sort of separate specific functionality out into separate files. I personally like using Requirejs, and with ES6 you have import available, so you can create modules for specific JavaScript functionality. And I like to use that to sort of focus my JavaScript on specific interaction points on the page. So if I have, a nav bar and then maybe a sidebar and then some elements that the user can interact with in the middle, I'll probably have a JavaScript module that will run any sort of code I need to run on my nav bar. I'll probably have one for my sidebar and one for sort of the content in the middle. Or if I have different components in the middle, a file for each component. Just because at that point, you're starting to get really big sites. You don't want this 10,000 line piece of JavaScript code you have to dig through. It's just easier to find the one file that controls that component and then dive into that. For these projects though, and for this particular nanodegree, you probably won't be writing 10,000 line long pieces of code, so you're probably okay with sticking with one file. A lot of questions about where you get the Udacity hat. I don't know if they're publicly available yet, but we're currently working on improving our sort of swag distribution and making sure you guys get a lot of great stuff when you graduate. So be on the lookout for an announcement about that, and you'll probably get an opportunity to get either water bottles, bags, shirts, hats. I'll let people know that there's a lot of interest in the hats here. Carol asks, is there a way to combine the 10 useful JavaScript functions to get even more out of them? And yes, absolutely. Even in some of our examples, we've combined some of these functions. And in fact, you can nest these functions within each other to apply a lot of the same methods together. And I highly encourage you to play around with them, see what you can do. Just be creative. Try some things out. If it breaks, that's okay. That's a good learning experience for you. Brent asks, what is the best practice when dealing with functions that are not compatible with all browsers? Great question, Brent. And usually we want to try and put a fallback in place in that case. I think the first thing, though, you need to ask yourself is, what is this method that I'm creating trying to solve? Or what is this function that I'm using trying to solve? If it's something that isn't really adding a lot to the site, then maybe there's another way around it where you can just write it up yourself in vanilla JavaScript, and then it's compatible across all browsers. If it's something that is like really new or experimental feature that you really want to use, then sometimes there might be a polyfill for it. I know a lot of platforms utilize, like jQuery and other tools, use polyfills to kind of account for people using IE8 and IE9, which might not support some of these more advanced JavaScript functions. So I'd say that the two things to really look out for is there a polyfill which will allow me to simulate the same behavior on older browsers or other browsers, or do I really need this function and can I write it myself? Let's see. Joseph asked if I can run the example so we can see the output. And Joseph, I don't think I have enough time to do that for all of them right now, but I'll share the links to these in the forum, in the front-end broadcast channel, so you guys can go ahead and play with them, run them yourselves, see the outputs. That way you guys get some familiarity with these functions. Mark asks, should I be on ES6? For those of you unfamiliar, ES6 is JavaScript Next, or also known as ECMAScript 2015 or 2016 now. And it's pretty much where JavaScript is going. If you want to start using it, I definitely recommend it. It's going to be, regular JavaScript soon enough. The only tough part about it is there is a bit of a learning curve because you do need to compile down your code or transpile your code down to ES5. So you need to use a tool like Babel or Google Tracer to turn your ES6 code into something usable by the browser, because not all browsers support it yet. But if you're interested in learning it, I definitely recommend it. It's the JavaScript that most developers are using now. And in fact, in the future, you'll probably be seeing a lot of examples using ES6 as people begin to transition away from ES5. Let's see. George asks, is there a rhyme or reason to JS function syntax? It seems like the Wild West to me. It is a little funky. I agree. It's not your standard sort of class-based system, and that's because JavaScript isn't a class-based language. It's a prototype language, and if you go through object-oriented JavaScript, you'll understand a lot more why the function syntax is a little weird. But it largely has to do with the fact that JavaScript isn't an object-oriented language or a class-based language. It's actually a prototype language, and that has a lot of implications on how we write functions and how functions are used. Ramon asks, why is there not a linked list type object in JavaScript? Is that because array does the same thing? More or less. I think if you really need some of the functionality of a linked list, you could probably write it yourself. Or I guess I gotta remember my computer science here. If you want to create a linked list in JavaScript, like a directed linked list, you kind of get that same functionality out of an array, but I don't think you'll necessarily need to use it too much. But if you want to, it's a pretty easy data structure to kind of code up yourself using JavaScript's prototype functions or prototype methods. Let's see. Milma asks, creating an event listener in a loop, how do you access properties of objects within the event handler? Objects in global scope are undefined. Yeah, so that's because the event handler has its own scope, which probably won't be able to interact with the objects in the global scope. So usually you have to pass those into the event handler. I think this is a pretty specific question, so maybe if you can ask us on the forum, we'd be happy to answer that. Going through here. Let's see. Aniko asks, Google PageSpeed Insights Analysis downrates jQuery.js that you can hardly call Ajax when you use Bootstrap as render blocking. Any suggestions? I think I'd have to see how you're using Ajax. I'm going to use Bootstrap as render blocking. I think the thing to remember is loading scripts is technically render blocking. So if you can load that script asynchronously, that might help. You might want to look into the async and defer tags that you can pass to a script and try and load something like jQuery asynchronously. And then in your JavaScript, don't execute those Ajax functions until it's fully loaded. Again, that's a pretty specific question, so feel free to put that one up on the forum and we'll try to get to it. All right, we're actually, I am out of time here, folks. If you have any more questions, feel free to put them up on the forum. As I mentioned, we'll be posting all this information on the forum for you guys to play around with the examples. And that's pretty much it, everybody. I hope you had a good day. Sorry again about the technical difficulties at the beginning. We'll try to get them all sorted out for our next webcast, which we'll hopefully have in 2 weeks' time. And also, if you guys have any suggestions for webcasts, we're very happy to take them. Feel free to post in the forums, in the front-end broadcast channel. That's where we'll be hosting all of this stuff. And good luck with all the projects, everybody, and have a good rest of your Tuesday. Bye.